Welcome back, everyone, to Tarot Journeys with Guy. How's everybody doing? So today we're going to delve a little bit more into the hidden story of the tarot and how it's relevant to today, I guess, in the time that we live in, but what is being transmitted to us and filling in some of the gaps of the tarot lessons that people are going through and stuff. I mean, there's a lot of people that watch and that I'm connected with that like to read the cards for themselves. Some are tarot readers. So I did one 3 days ago, I guess, kind of a beginning around spreads and numerology and how that kind of worked, right? So go and check that one out after you're done looking at that if you haven't seen that video already. And so now what we do is we kind of look at how the cards kind of set up, and how it's a system based on one level, how the number of cards and the division of the cards. That is also very telling of what the cards are for. And so with the tarot cards, traditional tarot cards consist of 78 cards, 22 being the Major Arcana and 56 being the Minor Arcana. Now, what we're going to look at is the Major Arcana first, because the Major Arcana is part of what begins that story. Like I've been kind of saying, like the hidden history, let's say, but also how this esoteric knowledge came to us, how the tarot came to us. Now you got to keep in mind where this is coming from is the Western world and the era of the medieval age and the Renaissance. Okay. These two periods are very prominent in what's being sort of brought to us. Now, there's a long history, and there's a long history on how the church, the Catholic Church, became an institution, and how laws and everything that came about into the modern era, how it came into being. What has been lost within that is the spiritual teaching, the spiritual root. And so what the cards have done for us, one thing that the cards is just one tool that comes out of that era that brings us these ancient traditions and brings us this esoteric key, as it were, in unlocking the true nature of the human form. As the Roman Catholic Church became more ingrained as an institution and politically, it also had endeavored to steer people away from this kind of knowledge and to eliminate it as well. In that time period, from the Middle Ages coming all the way up to the modern time, our time, the Bible, something like the Bible and the doctrine, the Christian doctrine, was in the hands of the priests, was in the hands of the church, and so a lot of what was not considered canon or considered orthodox in the sense of an accepted viewpoint was deemed heretical and was demonified and used against the people. And so we get an insight into the true nature of the shadow war and how the shadow war, because we were talking about the shadow war and this ongoing thing, has been going on for a very, very long time. The tarot is one of these things that sort of illustrates that, because the church and other parts of that infrastructure had endeavored to destroy this knowledge and to keep it away from people. In the Renaissance period, the printing press started to come out. And right around that time, wood block pressings started to become really in vogue, even before the printing press. And this is where we think that the tarot originates from. Now, many people, this is what people have been speculating for hundreds of years of where does the tarot come from. It first originated, or the first use of it brought to the public was in the 1700s, the middle 1700s, just before the French revolutions it was in the 1760s and the 1770s. And just before the American Revolution, 1776, and the beginning of the French revolutions in 1789 and onward, right? And that and spirituality and a form of spirituality that wasn't strictly Christianized started to become in the forefront. And this is where we started to see all these secret societies and things. And the cards are all wrapped up in this. Okay, so but after the 1700s, like into the 1800s, this is when it became out in the public and more in the vogue, right? And the tarot started to become like utilized and brought to the public. And then in the 70s, 1970, this is a big phase of the tarot cards where it became very out, and the publishing of cards and everything, and it became very in vogue, right? And this is where we see today. And I mean, there's many phases. The true beginning of the New Age was in the 1870 era. Okay, and so we've gone through succession, like phases of this. Okay, and so that's what the tarot speaks of. And so people have speculated, where does these cards come from? And it's the same thing with the playing cards. Okay, and so right from the beginning, one thing that was apparent with the cards was that it was not only like cardomancy and divination was a thing like what we do here, but it was also this way of telling a story, a picture story. Okay, and in the courts, like the Visconti tarot from Milan, those cards, those are some of the original cards still remain. There's like 16 of them, I think, or something. Don't get me wrong, but it's in the Milan Museum or somewhere like that. And they think that they were made in the aristocracy circles, right, as a present, right? And it was this way of conveying these taboo stories, these alternate ways of looking at these Gnostic stories that were sort of very prevalent in the northern part of Italy at that time. So, and that's like in the 1470s. That's one of the eras of the Renaissance. That in 50 years before, like in the 1440s, 1450s, around that time period was the Gutenberg press and the beginning of the printing press and the printing of Bibles outside of the church, and people started to be able to read for themselves, right? So this is what people have speculated, because in the cards themselves, even going back to the original cards and some of those original cards, whatever they are, those cards in the 1700s were like the cards that they were talking about and became popularized were the Tarot of Marseille. Okay, and when you see me doing the cards, I do use the Rider-Waite deck. Okay, and Rider-Waite comes from the 1890, 1880 to 1920s, around that time. I'd have to recheck the date when he came together with the woman that painted the images. It was like 1917, 1918, somewhere around there. I'd have to recheck that, but around that era, that's when they produced these cards and started to publish them. Okay, and the Rider-Waite cards are still sort of in that form, and they're a direct lineage to the Tarot of Marseille and the symbols that were there. And that was the thing, is like in the Renaissance period and the Neoplatonic sort of understandings that were kind of coming about, symbolism and allegory and this became very prominent, and people started to communicate through this. Okay, now this is where what we see with these dark side, deep state globalists versus the people, and the light side, I guess, is a way to look at it. We all have ties back there. Transhumanism comes out of humanism, but so does this kind of other thing that we're talking about as well, and we see this split. Now, this part of this story, always this long story of the true war, the shadow war, is that the dark side, let's just call them the dark side for right now, the other side, the enemy of the light, and those that have perpetuated this none of what they are performing, what they're throwing at people, and what they utilize is created on their own. In fact, their whole aim is to destroy. So all of it is a perversion and a subversion of the ancient primordial tradition, which is what the tarot talks about. Okay, and that plugs into all of the old traditions and all the old stories. So, right, and this is where, and people demify the tarot and have for a very long time. People online don't understand some of this stuff. I mean, these darksiders, these death cult globalists are utilizing similar techniques in the sense of their ritual and these ideas and these Gnostic understandings, okay? And if you look at the roots of some of the banking families and the big pharma conglomerates and even the big tech and but it's like the families, they kind of all have roots in that crusading era and leading up to the Renaissance, okay? A lot of the pharmaceutical companies, their families started out as dye makers. And those dye makers turned in, like some of them became alchemists. Okay, and this is another where we see the doctors. And with the tarot itself, this is what got people in the 1700s, was that this tarot cards express something that is outside of the Judaic Christian realm, even though it encapsulates that. And so in the 1460s, there was a rediscovery of Hermetic writings, okay, and the Hermetica. And part of that was, it was the first time in the Western world where there was something that came to the public's mind, or came to the mind of the intelligentsia of the time, that went back further than what was talked about in the Judaic Christian world and the history, or an alternate history, and it also plugged into it and didn't deviate too much. And so that was another thing that caught the fascination, but it was a rediscovery, and it was the same thing, like there was a rediscovery of all of the ancient Greek writings and all sorts of stuff, okay, and astrology, and a reconnection, right, with that ancient world. So for Christian world and these thinkers that didn't necessarily agree with the teachings of the Catholic Church, and especially this Christian view that the material world is negative, okay? The Hermetica presented a positive cosmic view, that the universe was created in a positive light. And so in the Bible and stuff, it doesn't necessarily say that the universe was created in a negative light, but there's been so much confusion around translations and languages and people not permitting other people to talk or to even possess the information, right? Very similar time. That was a huge thing. And so what they speculated on and what they thought was that the cards in some way are hieroglyphic. There was already contact with Egypt and things like this, but then in the Napoleonic times, Napoleon in his expedition down to Egypt had sort of really opened this up, and they really speculated that the cards themselves may have come from Egypt and it had a lot to do with the Hermetica. Now what we realize is not necessarily, okay, but what they were recognizing is this long lineage, this connection into the past, right? So what I've got laid out here is, this is the Tarot of Marseille. This is kind of a newer version of it. And this is sort of how it would have come to us with the wood block pressings. And a more of a modern version that kind of this was printed actually in the 70s, but it's sort of more of a modern version from the 1800s kind of thing. But it shows you the progression of the cards to the AE weight set. Now, AE weight is an interesting thing. So when you talk about the cards, now you kind of have to go and research these people, because that's also very telling as well. AE weight was started out in a lot of different circles, but more importantly in the Order of the Golden Dawn and the Rosicrucians, okay? And so in many ways, he took it upon himself, and the group that he was connected with, and Pamela Coleman Smith, who is the one that painted these, they took it on themselves to overlay a lot of this esoteric tradition and the understandings as a way of sort of releasing further this knowledge to the public, okay? And so that's why we see this massive difference in the cards. And so like the Rider Waite is just laden with the symbols, and those same symbols in a manner can be read from the cards themselves, but they had sort of stepped it up a notch, let's just say, okay? And so what's interesting is the first thing that we see, he's carrying a staff and what's called a script, or his wallet. And this is the sign of the hobo, of the traveler, of the pilgrim. Okay, and so you see that in this card here. And also from the medieval era, this guy is dressed as a court jester. Now, in the court jesters, this was a thing in the Aquitaine province area, Aquitaine area, southern France, and very distinct to the northern part of France. And it was its own culture. And these court jesters that would come and hold court in various circles of aristocracy, or courts of the king or baron or duke, and they would tell the story, they would sing the song, and this thing of chivalry and unrequited love was a big part of it. But we see this now in today. A lot of musical historians really kind of draw back a lot of lyrical songwriting, and what we see today in pop music and things going back to that time, right? And that's one thing that we see here, is this guy's dressed up. So it's this thing that goes back to the crusading era and the beginning of that era of the pilgrimage and the people moving back and forth and connecting with the Holy Land, to Palestine, to what was called the Levant at that time. So, and for the Christian world, Jerusalem and the Holy Land was the center of the universe, was the center of the world. And so to go to make a pilgrimage there, to the place of the birth of Abraham and Moses and Elijah and Jesus, okay, this long lineage, this was a very auspicious and prominent thing. And in fact, it kind of started the modern thing of tourism. This was, in the ancient world, a way of this was tourism in a sense. It was a very difficult journey. Many people died. And the church used it as a form of penance, that you would, if you were guilty of sin, which everybody was, that to pay off that penance, you would do a pilgrimage to various places. There was, and Jerusalem was one of them. That was one of the main ones. Okay, and so it was very difficult and hard to come back. What started the Crusades was this huge shift in the Roman Catholic thinking and the Christian worldview, in the sense of sanctioning holy war, which is hypocritical in many ways, or especially in the sense of the teachings of Jesus, where it's the opposite. So this really threw everything off, but it was a Reformation period where the church itself had become reformed over 100 years or so. And this idea that we needed to secure and claim, the Christian Western world, needed to reclaim Jerusalem. So it sparked this thing with the crusade. And the crusade itself was kind of an auspicious thing. It was the first time in the Western world since the Roman Empire where people were mobilized, and not just the aristocracy and the knights, but also the common people. Pope Urban II, or Pope Urban II, he was the Pope at the time that instituted this, that called the crusade. And he started in 1095, and by 1100, the Crusaders had captured and had completed their mission and had captured Jerusalem, okay? But his calling of the crusade, calling of the cross, he had done something, first time in Christian world, right, was people, if they accepted to go on the crusade and did the oath of the cross, they would receive full remission of sins, and no matter what. So this is a very, very interesting time period in that history, but this is what kind of sparked it. So a lot of people, basically the Roman Catholic Church, with their doctrine of original sin, basically stated that everybody was a sinner right from the beginning. and every step of the way. And their whole system was based on penance, right? This thing with the court gesture and what I'm saying, this pilgrimage, was this beginning of a release from this. And people started to see outside of the narrow worldview that the Catholic Church had over the people. So that's a big thing, right? So by around 1200, after the Third Crusade, a little bit before that, I mean, we started to see this big influx. It was a huge going back and forth. And these court gestures, some of these guys, these original troubadours, were crusaders. Some of them were on the First Crusade. Some of them stayed there for years and years. Some of them had come back. Some of them had started to tell the story of the ancient world, had started to tell the story of hidden books and things that were there. And another part of it was this idea of bringing back the goddess tradition and speaking of women in a positive light, in a loving light, in a heightened light. And in fact, this is where we start to see in the Catholic world a prominence towards Mary, the mother of Jesus, than Jesus in some ways. Okay, it was a part of this. Women were very attracted. Like, a lot of women went down on the Crusades. They tried to prevent the people from doing it. And if you get into the history of it, there's a lot there. Okay, but this was a big thing. This is what sparked people's attention, and they started to realize more and more how corrupted and how the church itself, what it was actually doing. Okay, and it was a way of reclaiming that esoteric key. There was other things that took part in that, but this is kind of what the tarot is expressing. So this journey coming back. So, and it's funny, he switched the direction, and it's definitely for more of a spiritual sort of reason, because he is facing the unknown, this idea of going off into the unknown and making the leap. But this journey from the unknown, this journey from the spiritual source is what the direction of this guy and where he's going from, right? He's moving towards the right, right? But that's not important, I guess, in the sense, he did it on purpose, though. He changed it on purpose to kind of give it more of a spiritual meaning. And so that's kind of a big thing. The dog also kind of represents like the fear, not allowing fear to get the best of you, being dogged by fear, okay, being chased by the hounds of the brutes that don't want you around, that kind of thing, right? But it was also a symbol of Hermes Trismegistus and the Hermetica, okay? And this is one of those things that he brought back. So the other thing is that when the cards started to come out, and you see this word here, les mat, the fool. Les fous, pardon my French, okay? My French is terrible, my pronunciation of French, I don't really know French that well, but that is the modern word for the fool. But in the medieval times, before modern French, les mat was used, okay? And there's different reasons. What's interesting is that this directly relates to the goddess Ma'at, M-A-A-T. Ma'at was the symbol of justice, a just society, and truth. And it was a symbol of civilization, okay? And that was another thing. This is why they speculated on the Egyptian origins. But he carries that back with him to the Western world, which had been lost, okay? And maybe really hadn't been reclaimed until the Renaissance. The Renaissance is a big sort of marker, 1453 and onward, let's say, sort of an entrance into the modern world, okay? And that's a kind of a thing, right? So on his cap, we see the feather. The feather, the long feather, that plume, is the symbol of truth in the hieroglyphics. It's the symbol of Ma'at, okay? And you see her beautiful hieroglyphs of her winged with this feather, okay? see, the other deal was the rose. The rose has got a very significant meaning in the biblical sense, and going back into the legends around the Old Testament and things like this, and the Rose of Sharon and how it relates to Jesus and comes from Solomon, this era of Solomon, but yet this idea of the white rose coming from paradise, that this was one of the original roses, okay? Now, the rose is a symbol also of Venus. Now, Venus is because it's an interesting thing. It's the same deal. It's like this reoccurring theme into the ancient world. But one of the esoteric hidden truths around Venus is that Venus is like a metronome. And if you follow Venus, and the ancients knew this, that at the point, if you traced out the point of its rising over a full cycle, you would realize that at that point, it draws out against the zodiac a 5-pointed star exactly. The other part of the story is the solar tradition, the solar aspects of religion that have always been sort of there, and that the hidden part of those solar religions isn't about worshiping the sun. It's about worshiping the true divine source, the high God that cannot really be spoken of, that is beyond our ability, and that's why we use that word, right? But this, even back in that time, the word God was becoming for certain circles, was becoming taboo. In the 1400s, they had already witnessed the hunting of heretics, and the hunting of witches was starting to sort of pick up, right? So these kind of truths had to be hidden because it totally went against Christian church, but yet it plugged into the core essence of what was being communicated, especially in the Bible and things like this, but like the teachings of Jesus, right? And so this was a thing that enabled people to plug into this story a lot better, okay? The other thing is they chose to have the dog in, it's so funny, the dog is man's best friend, human's best friend, of course, right? Dog represents love also. Even in the Western world, there's this loyalty and love, right? So it's like the story of love, the way of love, transmitted down through the ages. And he chose to use this picture, and it looks like the Pyrenees. If you've ever been to southern France and northern Spain and things like this, and seen pictures of it, is a beautiful area, and it's very mountainous, large peaks, and this is sort of, maybe in some ways it leads us to thinking that way, okay? And that it sort of takes us to sort of speculate on the Cathars and their kind of tradition and how they kind of communicated this sort of notion around Christianity. Now, I don't necessarily side with what the Cathars communicated, because they had a negative cosmic view and more of like a big G Gnostic view that was dualistic. What this is communicating, what the Hermetica communicates, is still from the monotheistic point of view, and maybe even more monotheistic than what the Roman Catholic Church was talking about, okay? And so that was the thing. It was like in Aquitaine and that area where the Cathars came about. In this time period, in the 1200s, it started way before, but in the end of the 1100s up until like the 1300s, but it was these group of people that called themselves true Christians, okay? And they claimed to hold secret knowledge and started to talk about how that the universe is inherently evil, and that what people think is a good God is an evil God, okay? And so in this thing, and people didn't really know too much about this stuff, and it really kind of talks about, and what this card and what AEY was trying to sort of talk about is how this phase of religion goes through many, many phases, and that it is a syncretic thing, what Christianity, what the Catholic Church has presented. It's an amalgamation of old traditions and it goes back to the ancient Egypt, ancient Greek, right? And that these ideas have been incorporated into the current mytho, Okay. And so within the Cathars, they had this thing of duality, and they believed in this, this idea that even in the Old Testament, in the Jewish form of it, in the Old Hebrew, there's talk of a jealous and an angry God versus the true God and the God of light, and this idea that there's two forces that are co-eternal, which this is not something that I believe, but this story is something that was prevented from people. The fool in some of these Gnostic teachings, in these documents that we have found, and they started to find them in the 1880s right up until now. Some of them, like the Nag Hammadi Library and the Quorum jars, the Quorum texts that were found, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, those were discovered in 1947, just after World War II, and 1953, and right in that time period where Israel as a modern nation was formed. And so you see how there's these connections, right? The fool, then what we realize is if you look at the Apocryphon of John or the Book of Truth, in the Cathar world, it's called the Secret Supper. Is one of the few remaining Cathar documents, but talking about how this evil God, which we think is the real God, is what created the material world, and that's evil, and that his name was Scala, which meant fool. Right? So this is another part of this part of the story was brought to the Western world. And nobody knew very little about. There were documents, we start to realize, nobody knew anything about the Essenes or any of these kind of things that we kind of understand now because there's a lot of information out there. But this idea of this evil God versus this good God, this is actually what got the Cathars completely eliminated. It's called the Albigensian Crusade. And the Albigensian Crusade started in 1209 and didn't really end till 1240. There were phases of it though. They don't really refer to it because it was a genocide. They wiped out the Occitanian culture. This is what the tarot is talking about. This is what A.E. White wanted to direct people to. This is what the tarot itself talks of. Okay, and so the Hermetic view is more of this idea that from the mind, the infinite mind, and the break off of that mind, that it's this idea of the shadow versus the light, and that the shadow has become manifest because of the psyche of the human mind, of the human form and the free will of the human form, and going down that road. But also it's this idea of how we have to kind of move through these periods, and that kind of friction is where we start to realize the wholeness and the truth of reality. Okay, so it was an alternate view. It wasn't a damning viewpoint. This is a big part of it, right? With the Cathars, the big thing with the Cathars was that women could become priests. They could become what were called the bonhommes, the good men, or the prefecti, or the perfect. And they would go around and they would give the consolamante, or the consolamantum. It's the consolation, which was different than the confirmation. And it was this laying of hands and releasing the light from the physical world. But yet they were righteous people, and the people liked them. The people really, whether they agreed with their philosophy or not, these traveling men and women that would go around and preaching what they deemed as the gospel, were calling out the corruption of the Catholic Church and the corruption of the world. The negative part of it was that they were against reproduction. Very adamant. And very adamant that there was a evil God ruling the world. They were vegetarian, vegan, all, and it's well known. And so you can kind of see where some of this idea comes within these deep state, death cultists, globalists. Because in many ways it might come from that, in that understanding, because I know there's groups of these guys in power in these organizations stuff. It's like a revenge trip, and they're trying to unseat what they perceive as the root of civilization, which is God, and replace it with their own God, or replace it with the evil God. There's certain sects that, like in the Gnostic world, that sort of believed in order to get to the light, you got to pay homage to the dark. And they really believe this idea of dualism, right? I mean, the sages and the prophets and the teachers have always known that there's layers to this, and part of it is an allegory. And that the whole aim is to get to the true seat of source, which is first within the human form, right? And to sort of access that. What else have we got here? Yeah, that's a lot of information. I mean, the big takeaway is that Catholic Church didn't want people to fully know what took place in the southern France region. Shortly after all of that started to happen, the modern boundaries of France started to take on, and the northern, like what we see as like the French culture, the French language, basically took over. Sort of a big thing, and it just kind of illustrates how much covering up has been done. Okay, we know a lot more than when the 1400s started to happen, and in the 1600s and the 1700s, a lot more has come out, right? That's a big part of it. The other kind of interesting thing that I didn't really mention, but this is kind of a big part of this traveling, is that this is where we start to see the Romani, the gypsy people, come in the 1400s and moving around, and they're also responsible for transmitting this kind of knowledge and the ability to divine and the psychic side of it, gifted with the art of cartomancy and divination. And in a lot of ways, that's how we got it, right? They came in that same motion from east to west to east. And this connection to the ancient world, whereas worldview of Western Christianity was very small and hadn't really recovered yet from the fall of the Roman Empire. It hadn't in places, but no, not like what we see in the Renaissance and what we see. And it's like funny, the first crusading period in the 1200s, that is considered the first Renaissance in some ways. This is where we see Gothic architecture being built up and all of the rich history that people kind of think about when they think about European Christian culture, right? And the history that's there. This is what this is pertaining to. This is kind of a very clear thing. The other thing is the zero, and the marking of it as the zero. And it's kind of a funny thing, because people have always argued, where do we place the card in the order of the cards? And in many ways, it was like a lot of like what A. White and some of these guys really believed was that it was part of the secret key. They kind of did it on purpose to fool those that weren't in the know. And so if you know, you know. The zero is also kind of an interesting thing, because it also, if you look at the history of mathematics and numbers and things like this, the use of the figure zero and writing it down as zero started shortly after the Third Crusade, in the end of the 1100s, in 1190, beginning of the 1200s, and moving up. And also the 1470s, those two eras is when they became very, very prominent, okay? The other thing is the chaptering and the verse, breaking down the Bible, the Old and the New Testament. In the 1200s, in the 1260s, they first broke it down into chapters, old and agreed upon. And then in the 1500s, beginning of the 1500s, they broke it into verses, okay? So, and if you look at the chapters, and like the 22nd chapter in various books is very prominent and is part of that key. And I'll talk a little bit more about the numbers tomorrow. We're going to do a little thing tomorrow. So what we're going to do now is we're going to just do a little mini read on, just to illustrate and to kind of continue the spread, the idea of the spread in numerology and stuff. And just a little read, we're going to do a little like spiritual check-in. What do we need to hear? Just more like energetic, what's going to help us, because how we're going to do is we're going to do so I did a 3-card spread to illustrate. Now we're going to do a 4-card spread. Now I usually do the 3-card spread with 1 card as like an advice, right? But we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to do it as it pertains to the 4 elements, the 4 suits in the minor arcana, right? We have the fire with the wands, the cups, and water and emotion, right? And then we have the swords, which represent the mind, and the material world with the coins, with the pentacles. Okay, a quick little read, just to kind of illustrate what we got going on here. And the 4, so 22, the 22 cards of the Major Arcana, if we take 2 plus 2 equals 4, okay? The higher form of the 4, like what we were talking about, is all of the different things that come with that card. There's so much there, right? Breaking down to the 4 represents the material world. It represents all aspects of the material world and the lesson of the material world. And so like the 4 elements represent the 4 books of life, let's say. Okay, and in the ancient philosophy, in the ancient world, going back even before the Greeks, but in the Greek world we see this, but in that part of the world which the Catholics deemed pagan, right? Describing the world using elements was part of it, right? And so fire represents the will and the spiritual, part of the spiritual urge, right? The cups represent emotion and also another part of that spiritual impulse that comes from the heart. Okay, so these 2 cards are definitely of the spiritual nature. And then we've got the mind with the swords, communication, mind, everything that kind of revolves around here. And then we've got the physical world with the coins, right? And so these 2 kind of represent the material world. I hope this is clear, right? This is a lot of information. So what we got in the sort of like in the area of will, the creative energies is with the fire, right? And what sort of motivates us, what inspires us. And it's just like the ability right now to be able to move and having flexibility in your world, right? So in the material world, this is very important, and not to get sort of stuck on one side or the other. You'll realize if you know, I mean, we do need to have focus. We need to have the like direction and focus, but also the ability to move with it. Okay, and that's kind of what the two of Pentacles represent. Funny, eh? Coins in the material part and cups. So coins, material, represent the material world in the spiritual area, and then we've got the cups in the material. So it's like kind of bringing balance between the material and the spiritual world, right? So into the emotional area, the 3 of coins represents like connecting with the right people in a lot of ways, right? But it's like the right person for the right task, getting task oriented. It's like, yeah, being with your people, being with the right people, recognizing who you can work with and who you can't, who you can be with and who you can't. Those are the people that you can be with. Those are the people you need to be with. It's very important right now. And then within the mind, it's like walking away from the negative emotion that you've picked up in the past, right? So it's like letting go of the past, not letting what has taken place in the past to hold you back, actually using it to fortify you, like reflecting on all of the things that have brought you to the present moment for your journey, okay? But it's like getting out of negative thinking patterns and getting into more positive in it and affirming mental patterns, okay? And then in the physical world, be present for the material world, right? It's, nostalgia, there's a place for nostalgia, but don't get too nostalgic. Like, oh, the past, it was so much better in the past. No. We live in such exciting times. There's so many things going on, so many different opportunities. And so when you start plugging this in and you start thinking that way, that's when it starts to manifest. Okay. But yet this is also another thing of like actively letting go of the past. It's like actively clearing away the past. If you're holding on to things that are attaching you to negative circumstances or this thinking, just get rid of it. Drop it. It's so necessary right now. We need to be sort of like in our, like in best form in a lot of ways, especially spiritually. Okay, everybody. I hope you enjoyed. That was a lot. Check out stuff online that I talk about, and leave a comment below and ask me questions and stuff like that. So wherever you are, please take care of yourself. Hit the subscribe button, like the video, and I hope to see you on the next one. Bye-bye.